Following the success of Final Fantasy in Japan throughout the Famicom era, Square were encouraged to work on even greater projects. And as they looked forward to the next generation of consoles, Final Fantasy IV would end up being a formative entry as the franchise evolved into its next phase. Described as a game that combined the best parts of each preceding game, when Final Fantasy IV released in 1991, there was an immense level of praise for its introduction of the famous ATB system, as well as its redefining of dramatic storytelling in video games. Its impact has also not been lost over time, with polished re-releases and a well-received remake being produced. Beyond that, numerous high-profile publications around the world have chosen to feature Final Fantasy IV when talking about some of the greatest games of all time. With it being the first major game produced within this new era though, it means there are plenty of interesting tidbits relating to its development, as well as some intriguing pieces of trivia relating to the game itself. And it's why, for today's video, we're excited to run through a slew of information relating to Final Fantasy IV that we're confident you didn't know. So strap yourselves in as we explore some fascinating trivia from one of the most iconic numbered titles in the franchise, starting with the very interesting story as to how Final Fantasy IV wasn't actually meant to be Final Fantasy IV at all. Throughout the history of the Final Fantasy franchise, there have been many instances where projects have had quite extreme changes in direction midway through development. A recent example would be Final Fantasy Versus 13, which was rebranded as Final Fantasy 15, with wholesale changes made in a very public fashion. But Final Fantasy X would also undergo some pretty severe changes, as behind closed doors, the entire cast of characters outside of Tidus and Yuna were cut, and an entirely new cast were created. Many years prior, Final Fantasy IV suffered a similar fate, but the nature of the change would end up being quite extreme. After the release of Final Fantasy III, Square had a decision to make. With the Famicom still flourishing, they could choose to make a fourth Final Fantasy for that console, but they could also look forward to the next generation, producing a fourth Final Fantasy game for the Super Famicom. In the end, they decided to do both. In an odd move, this would see Final Fantasy V announced before Final Fantasy IV, with Sakaguchi also revealing that they even planned to release the games out of order. They felt it would be beneficial to associate themselves with the hype surrounding the Super Famicom, as they believed the Famicom install base was already established enough that people would pick up the game regardless of when it released. Preparations for both games would begin around the same time, in May of 1990, but even though a fair amount of progress was made with what was meant to be Final Fantasy IV, it was clear by the end of that year that something was wrong. It would see Sakaguchi allude to problems with development when speaking with Famitsu in November of 1990. He said that the release of Final Fantasy IV was no longer set in stone due to market conditions, with staff having transitioned off the project to work on Final Fantasy V instead. On the 22nd of February 1991, Square would then issue a statement confirming the cancellation of Final Fantasy IV and the rebranding of Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy IV. They declared that, upon reflection, the Famicom version of Final Fantasy IV just was not good enough and was not up to the standards they expected from a Final Fantasy game. They had also realised just how much more powerful the Super Famicom was in comparison to the Famicom, and felt that the two games would not end up having a positive relationship with each other, especially if the Super Famicom version was planned to release first. To ensure efforts were not wasted, elements of the cancelled version of Final Fantasy IV would then be fused into the new version of Final Fantasy IV, something that was aided by the two teams working in close proximity at Square's headquarters. But the new game would remain closely aligned with the original vision, with Sakaguchi revealing that what was then known as Final Fantasy V would feature a story that was closer in line with Final Fantasy II than 1 or 3, that there would be playable female protagonists, no job change mechanics, an overhauled battle system, and according to Nobuo Uematsu, that there would be a love theme specifically written for the game. In the immediate aftermath, Sakaguchi downplayed how much work had been done on the Famicom version of Final Fantasy IV. When speaking to Japanese publication Hippon Super, he stated that the project had never made it out of concepting phase, something that was also noted by Kaoru Noriyama, who was a PR specialist and translator for Square in the early 90s. However, according to numerous Japanese blogs, Sakaguchi would later recant that version of events, stating that the game was around 80% complete when it was cancelled, and that he didn't reveal the truth around the time due to the shame the team felt about what had happened. When it comes to glitches, it's a well-known fact that the older Final Fantasy games contained all sorts of interesting bugs. Some of these would end up hindering player progress, but others could be exploited. And one such glitch, dubbed the MP Underflow glitch, not only benefited players, but would also circumvent the game's lore. After being triggered, the MP Underflow glitch would grant infinite MP to magic casting characters. It would take specific steps to achieve, but if executed successfully, players would effectively be able to perform magic without any MP costs. However, the drawback was that the target character would no longer be able to perform magic outside of battles. This meant there was a risk-reward to this kind of glitch, but it also had an interesting aside when applied to Teller. One of the big story beats focused on Teller, who, in light of his personal backstory, was restricted to a static value of 90 MP. This meant that even though he knew the spell Meteor, he would never be able to cast it during a regular encounter, as it cost 99 MP. When he did use Meteor, it would of course be a pretty important story moment, something that was of course made even more impactful due to his inability to use it anywhere else. But by enacting the MP Underflow glitch, the regular restriction would be removed, allowing Teller to cast Meteor whenever the player pleased, without the lore-based sacrifice being required. It makes this glitch pretty fun to use, and from a lore perspective, having Teller use Meteor in such a casual manner would end up being rather ironic, and also kind of paradoxical. Now, most games nowadays are subject to all sorts of updates and patches. The initial objective of this was often to fix bugs and provide small enhancements, but the concept has now evolved as a vessel for adding pretty significant content updates outside of paid-for downloadable content, with Final Fantasy XV serving as one of the most extreme examples. It's also a nice luxury that can be used to buy developers more time, but back when Final Fantasy IV was being developed, such luxuries were not available. Even still, the developers ended up getting creative when it came to fixing the original game, and it saw 3 separate versions of Final Fantasy IV released to the market within a very short period of time. The initial version of Final Fantasy IV was released in Japan during the summer of 1991, but it didn't stay on store shelves for very long. This was because a daunting glitch known as the Underworld AI or Suicide Enemy glitch was discovered. This glitch related to how the game would store memory addresses of the different locations the player traversed. This data would then be used to load different enemy encounter tables for each area. But in the case of Final Fantasy IV, because many areas had very similar memory addresses, the game was unable to differentiate between locations in the overworld, even if the player had left the vicinity. This would sometimes cause the wrong enemy table to load, something that would lead to an encounter with a group of enemies using stone on themselves until they were defeated. Due to the severity of the glitch, Square were forced to stop selling the game, but they were able to use this to their advantage. Square had already started work on a North American localization of the game, and alongside fixing the glitch, there were a whole host of other changes made, including making the game much easier, as they believed it would be too complex for North American players, especially as they had not had exposure to Final Fantasy II or III. Other changes would be related to characters, such as Gilbert being changed to Edward, the censorship of profanity and references to blood, death, and religion, and some visual aesthetic changes. As work progressed, Square also decided to release an updated version of the game in Japan. This was dubbed version 1.1 or revision A, but it would be based on the North American localization. As such, it would share many of the same changes, such as a lower difficulty, but Square also made the script much easier to understand, adjusted the names of items and monsters, and kept numerous gameplay revisions, one of which included Zeromus getting an entirely new sprite for his final form. This version would then be released in Japan as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type just 4 months after the original game, and despite it being an iteration of the North American localization, which was released as Final Fantasy II, it would actually be released a month earlier. And this meant that all things considered, Final Fantasy IV would have 3 separate versions of the game, each with their own unique quirks, released in just a period of 5 months. As the Final Fantasy series transitioned from the Famicom to the Super Famicom, the development team were given more creative capacity for content building. And as we discussed within our initial fact, this led to the scope of what was then Final Fantasy V at the time being much grander in comparison to the cancelled Final Fantasy IV. But it would end up being far too grand, and the team would have to downsize in order to accommodate for the capacity limitations of the Super Famicom, even though they were still much larger than the team was used to working with. It's unclear how much of the game was affected, but it has been revealed that in relation to the game's script, its content would end up being reduced by 75% as a consequence. A common misconception is that this meant there were wholesale changes made to the wider scenario, but in fact, it was more that the scenario was proactively altered to accommodate for the restrictions, something that just made it more streamlined while still retaining the same sentiment. As shared by Takashi Tokita, who served as the lead game designer and scenario writer on Final Fantasy IV, this meant that a ton of unnecessary dialogue was just removed, and in the end, they felt this only served to improve the game's pacing. Tokita would, however, acknowledge that in some parts they had been perhaps a bit too extreme, leading to the story having a lack of context or clarity in certain areas. And it was for this reason that when working on the Final Fantasy IV remake, Tokita chose to reintroduce some scenes so the context could be made more clear. Now, alongside the MP Underflow glitch which we discussed earlier in the video, Final Fantasy IV would feature another curious bug that could be exploited to the benefit of players. Known as the enemy revival glitch, this bug would allow players to exploit random encounters to gain a huge volume of drops from enemies after they were defeated. But what made the bug noteworthy was the nature of its existence. Throughout the history of Final Fantasy, it's always been possible to cast restorative spells on both friend and foe. In some instances, spells such as Raise or Revive could be used to inflict an instant death status on enemies, and healing spells could be used to deal harm. But although healing spells could also heal enemies if they didn't have the negative association with the element, Revive magic would only be effective when used by the party on a fellow downed party member. Except in Final Fantasy IV. As the name suggests, the enemy revival glitch would allow players to bring enemies back to life after being KO'd, but the circumstances would be quite curious, as when revived, the enemy would have 0 HP, causing it to die immediately once again. To trigger the bug, players would need to have a character cast a life spell or use a life item on an enemy on the verge of death, and then have another character deal the killing blow. When revived, the foe character's sprite wouldn't appear, but the animation of the life spell or item would still play out. The game would then register this as a second kill, which would ultimately double the rewards related to experience points, gil, and potential drops. As such, this is an especially useful glitch to use when grinding or farming. Over the years, developers have planted many Easter eggs throughout Final Fantasy games. Some have been quite obvious, but others have often been hidden in plain sight, such as the books in the Shinra Manor making the shape of the Roman numeral for 7. Final Fantasy IV would feature a similarly subtle hidden message within the HP values of GOLBEZ'S. In the original game, GOLBEZ would join the party as a guest character as the game drew to its conclusion. This would see him team up with Fusoya for an epic final stand against Zemus, and it was here that we saw GOLBEZ had 2,943 HP. On first glance, this would seem like a pretty random number, no different from the arbitrary HP levels other characters would be given when joining the party. And to an English speaker, that would very much be the case. But to a Japanese speaker, the number was very subtle and very purposeful. Based on the concept of wordplay, the number 2,943 could be read as Nikushimi, the Japanese word for hatred. This would allude to how Zemus had manipulated GOLBEZ by provoking feelings of hatred within him to control his will. Within Final Fantasy IV The After Years, GOLBEZ'S starting HP would then be adjusted slightly to 2,971. Again, this may have seemed random, but it was purposeful. In Japanese, the wordplay would be read as Sunagai, the Japanese word for atonement, signifying his resolve to correct his misdeeds in the previous game. And that brings us to our final, very interesting fact, that Square were in provisional conversations with Disney to produce a comic book spin-off of Final Fantasy IV. It's no secret that the Final Fantasy franchise has quite a decorated history when it comes to high-profile collaborations. In more recent years, this has included partnerships with brands and individuals such as Coca-Cola, Louis Vuitton, Audi, and even Ariana Grande. Back in the early 90s, Square were still figuring things out though, but they were keen to explore opportunities for expanding their properties outside of creating follow-up games, specifically in North America, and it saw them explore a very intriguing joint venture with Disney via their Hollywood Comics subsidiary. It would be a project that involved Kurt Busiek, who had been working on numerous Marvel comics. He would then be supported by Del Barras and John Constanza, with Mike Mignola designing the covers. 4 issues would end up being written, with 4 covers also produced. However, even though 2 whole issues had been drawn up, the project was cancelled halfway through the completion of the second issue as Hollywood Comics essentially went bankrupt. In 2020, Busiek would take to Twitter to share some of the unknown details behind the ill-fated project. He went on to reveal the extent of what was actually completed, also sharing some of the proposed artwork. He would also reveal that Square gave him liberty to make changes that he felt would enhance the story for North American readers, a liberty that was intended to be exercised. For example, Busiek wanted to change several character names such as Cecil and Kane, as he didn't feel as though the names given by the original writers were strong enough or reflective of the character archetypes they represented. At the time, Busiek believed these changes would be appropriate, but with hindsight, he's kind of glad the comic was never published. And that's because in today's landscape, he believes Final Fantasy fans would not have found it very appealing due to how much it strayed away from the game's canonical narrative. And with that, we have reached the end. They were 7 facts about Final Fantasy IV that we're confident you didn't know. Of course though, I'm sure there were some amongst you who knew them all. Either way, which did you feel was the most interesting? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to give a big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galcian Dikujata, Gregory and Lord of Morning, who are all super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.